Well, hello and welcome. I'm starting this video off a little bit differently than I normally do, because in this video, we're going to be doing a direct comparison against the Gen 3 standard 3x magnifier and the Gen 4 long eye relief version, both from primary arms. So for the entirety of this video, the Gen 3 is going to be on the left, and the Gen 4 is going to be on the right. Now, I tried to film these segments to be perfectly lined up with one another. I got them pretty close, but I think it'll be fine for you, the viewer, to really see what I'm trying to get across to you. And that is just how much more superior the Gen 4 is. Again, both of these are being fairly inexpensive. The Gen 3 comes in around $70, the Gen 4 around $100, but what does that $30 difference give you? Well, you're about to find out.
Let's get right down to brass tacks. We have the Gen 3 base on the left and the Gen 4 LER or long eye relief on the right. I'll be referring to them as such. We're going to do a real quick eye box test just to see how well these will work when you're not perfectly behind them. Now, I'm going to do a little bit more later on, but for right now, just to give you a basic idea of how they're going to function when you're slightly off to one side, they perform quite well. Or rather, I should say the LER performs quite well. Keep in mind, there is no optic in front of this magnifier right now, so we're looking strictly through the magnifier, nothing else. Now, before we put a red dot in front of it, take a real good look at how much better the LER looks as opposed to the Gen 3. It is an incredible difference that $30 can make, huh? It really makes me wonder why they even offer the Gen 3. So now we're looking through the StrikeFire 2 from Vortex. Just look at that difference. The Gen 3 shows the dot in the middle, yeah, that's fine, but it also shows a significant amount of the body of the red dot itself. Whereas the Gen 4 on the right, you see nothing but the dot, which is all you're supposed to see. This is the first time I've seen anything like that with the Gen 3. Both the Holosun HMX3X and the Vortex Micro 3X didn't have this issue. In keeping with my reviews being as thorough as possible, I'm going to remove the StrikeFire 2 and replace it with my Holosun 512. Reason being, the viewport on the 512 is this big, beautiful square, as opposed to the StrikeFire, which is a fairly small tube. Now, you would think that the Gen 3 would be able to look through this rather large optic quite well, but alas, you see a lot of the body as well. Whereas with Gen 4 LER, it is as good as one could expect from an optic that's $100. In fact, I'd even hazard to say it's even better than that. The blue tint from the 512 is very clearly visible in both of them, but to my eye, the Gen 4 looks a lot less blue than the Gen 3 and is absolutely crystal clear. I'm really impressed by the Gen 4's performance, because for $100, I was not expecting it to look this good. In fact, I'm going to go out there and already start this conversation now by saying I'd say it's at least as good as the HMX3X. But enough of that. Let's put on another red dot. This just so happens to be Alex's 503 Holosun, then you can very clearly see, probably here more than any other optic, just how much of a difference you can expect from the Gen 3 to the Gen 4. Now, the optic height is of course different, as you can clearly see, but with the Gen 4 it's still 100% usable, whereas with the Gen 3, throw it away. The performance out of the Gen 4 in this particular setup is as good as the Holosun HMX3X that Alex also gave me with his 503. Even though they weren't matched up properly, they both worked perfectly fine. Here is my Gen 1 UH1, and the height on this is actually a lot lower than I was expecting, so it's not really ideal. But once again, despite the fact that this optic is a lot lower than the magnifier is, with the Gen 4 it still works, I would say, about 75 to 80%, whereas with the Gen 3, you can barely look through the damn thing. So far there hasn't been a single moment when the Gen 3 has even come close to the Gen 4. Changing scenery a little bit, we are now at my home away from home, the 50-yard line at my local shooting range. And here we're going to do basically the exact same thing. With the exception, we're just going to be panning back and forth a little bit to see how much distortion these optics have on surround, as opposed to just looking through the red dot, or at least for the first segment of this little video. Now, one key thing to note here, I'm testing out the LER's long eye relief by moving it forward on the pick rail by one slot. I wanted to see if it was still completely functional, being a little bit farther away from it. Basically testing out to see if this thing is a true long eye relief magnifier. Again, here the Gen 3 doesn't hold a candle to the Gen 4. The Gen 3 has a lot of fisheye and a lot of warping at the edges, whereas the Gen 4 looks really true to form. Very little issues whatsoever. Putting the 512 back on, and with the Gen 4 at least, you do see a little bit of the body of the red dot itself at 6 o'clock, but that is because we are slightly pushed forward of where we normally would. Honestly, it's still a really good performance considering you can still see basically all the way through it. As opposed with the Gen 3, well, there's nothing really new with Gen 3. It looks really bad, and you see a lot more of the body of the red dot. Off with the 512 and on with the 503. And with the Gen 4, you're going to see that there is much more of a problem now than when it was earlier. This, again, is because we are pulled back from the magnifier by a fair bit, whereas the Gen 3, it's still, well, shit. The Strike-Fire 2 is up next, and with the Gen 4, you can see that we do see a little bit of tunneling going on, kind of what the Gen 3 is doing, but on a much lower scale. Again, this is because we're pulled back on it. Whereas with the Gen 3, it's just it's barely even usable. Like, how could you expect to really look through this and expect to see anything? I know I can't, and I would just be so upset if I had bought one of those, knowing now that the Gen 4 for $30 more is just so much more superior in every single way. Now we're going to test the elevation and windage controls on both these magnifiers, using a Holosun 512 as our reference point. You would expect that with the degree, at least, that when we play around with the elevation, you might be able to see through it a little bit better, but as you can see, it's clearly not the case. Whereas with Gen 4, you can literally ramp it to either extreme and still not see much of the body. Now, this is set up with basically perfect eye relief, so there's no issues like what we had earlier at 50 yards. And now is a good time in this video to really showcase just how much more of the mag you see on the Gen 3 as opposed to the Gen 4 on the actual outside of it. It really makes a huge difference. And I know it might be difficult for you to comprehend that looking through this video, but in person and getting behind it, you see so much more of your surroundings with the Gen 4 that by itself to me is worth the extra price point, let alone the higher quality glass and the better performance looking through multiple different red dots. I can't stop saying enough good things about this, but I'm starting to repeat myself, which is going to be a common thing in this video, primarily because I'm really in love with the Gen 4. Whereas with the Gen 3, it's just shit. It sucks. I don't know why PA still makes it. Last thing with being down in the garage, I just want to see how well both these magnifiers hold up with a really bright illuminated reticle like you see here on the 512. This thing gets too bright, in fact, I would say, in most cases. And here you could really see that the Gen 3 doesn't look much worse than Gen 4 unless you're looking at the 3 and 9 o'clock position on the Gen 3, where it completely just like does this weird bar thing. It's ugly. You can see it in both of these magnifiers that the reticle of the 512 is ghosting. You can see it reflecting back and forth, but that is not due to the magnifier. That is due to the 512 being in the dark environment and the reticle being too bright and it's just reflecting back inside the actual body of the 512. You step it down like you see right now, and it does get better, even though the reticle might be a little bit darker than what I would actually use it at. The Gen 4 handles it a lot better than the Gen 3 in my opinion. And one last time, we're going to do a quick eye box test, freewheeling it here to show you just how more usable and practical the LER Gen 4 is compared to the Gen 3. It's the exact same thing I've said since the beginning of this video, and you're gonna hear it one more time in my final thoughts right now, but it is a no comparison between these two.
Is there much more to really talk about between these two? Well, you might be asking about weight, because you know what? Everyone does, apparently. As far as how these two compare, Gen 3 comes in 8.9 ounces, and the Gen 4 comes in 7.3. So not only are you getting a much better performing piece of glass, but you're also getting it in a little bit lighter than this as well. So yeah, this is $30 more expensive, but this is a piece of garbage. I wouldn't recommend this to anybody for any reason. I want a budget red dot magnifier. Go with this one. Take the $30 that you would save with this, or put into something else, and just get this. In fact, I'm done with talking with this. This is going to the side, and I'm going to do something with that. I don't know, but it actually bothers me, because why does Primary Arms produce that and this when this is clearly just superior in every single facet and imagination? As far as how this stacks up with something like the HMX3X from Holosun, extremely well in my opinion. Which would I rather have? It's tough to say. This would still be less expensive. Even if you're buying a decent mount, which is roughly $50 or so, this will still come in $50 less expensive than the HMX3X. And at that point, you're saving $50 and you're getting something that's performing quite well. Now, I know Primary Arms has a pretty good warranty service. I've never tested it, I've never been part of it, but I haven't really heard many complaints about it. So if you're worried about how this is going to last long term, at least if it gets destroyed or something happens to it, you should be covered. I will say this though, I would much rather have this and a mount as opposed to the Vortex Micro 3X, because I just wasn't too fond of how the Micro 3X was. And the one main complaint I had with that was the eye relief. This LER, that acronym, actually stands for what this was designed for, which is to have longer eye relief. And you saw it in the video. In the beginning, I had it a little bit closer. Then I switched it up and had a little bit farther, a whole pick rail click farther forward, and it still worked perfectly fine. I couldn't do that with this. I couldn't even do that with, I believe, the HMX3X, nor with the Micro 3X from Vortex. This is stellar. And this is probably my go-to budget option right now, unless you really just like Holosun, in which case the HMX3X is excellent. Now, if you want to run this with like what I was doing, just a regular 30mm ring, you could do that too. Why not? You might even already have a set of rings that might work. And if not, these Monstrum rings are fairly cheap. I would recommend getting one with a quick release though, so this way it's easier to take on and off. But you're looking at sub $200 for this. $150, like I'm saying. I'm going to stop right here because I'm just repeating myself. No need to have this video go on any longer. This is excellent. Truly, truly excellent. A huge thank you to all of my Patreon providers for this, because without you, this video couldn't be possible. You see, because my Patreon providers, I was able to afford both of these to do this comparison. So again, thank you very, very much. And thank you all very much for watching. See you again next time.